Hello and welcome to this video on government expenditure. In this video, we're going to look at what is meant by government expenditure, the relationship between government expenditure, aggregate demand, and the circular flow of income, and then finally look at the main influences on government expenditure. So let's start off with this snapshot of the government's financial position in the UK. The government collects tax receipts, that's money coming into the government, through a number of different sources. For example, income tax on workers' earnings, corporation tax on businesses' profits, VAT, things like excise duty, so tax on charges on alcohol and cigarettes and stuff like that, and a whole host of other sources of duties or taxes. They then use that money to spend on government expenditure. So things like social protection, which we might call welfare payments or benefits, maybe healthcare, the NHS, or perhaps education, schools and colleges, maybe the armed forces, the police, transportation. It's a whole host of goods and services that the government spend money on and provide. Now, when the government spend more than they receive, they need to borrow the difference, and we call that a fiscal or government or budget deficit. And they can borrow this from members of their own country, private individuals, or perhaps businesses or private individuals from abroad. So we're going to look at this concept in a bit more detail in this video today. Okay, let's start by looking at some key terms. Tax revenue is income that is gained by governments through taxation, and that can be both direct and indirect, which we will address in another area of the syllabus. Here we have some examples of different types of source of tax revenue. Second key term is government expenditure. This is the overall public spending carried out by the government. And again, we have some examples of the types of spending the government undertake. Thirdly, budget deficit. This is where the amount the government spends exceeds the amount it raises in tax. And if that's the case, the government often has to borrow the difference. So when the government spends more than it receives in tax, we describe that as being a budget, government budget, or sometimes a fiscal deficit. Now, if the government is spending more, it's more of an injection, than they're taking out a withdrawal, this will increase aggregate demand in the economy. Budget surplus is the flip side, and that is when the government tax revenues exceeds the amount it spends in a year. And this would help pay back any debt that the government might have. Here, the withdrawal will be greater than the injection, so this will decrease AD. The final key term is national debt, which I've just referred to, and that is the total amount that the government owe. The government owe, not everybody in the economy, but just the government. That's the total amount they owe and have to pay back. So it's normally the accumulation of previous budget deficits. So we can have a look at the current situation, and the current UK government have a budget deficit. And they have done for a number of years. So the government has been spending more than it's received in taxation. And a current objective of government is to reduce this. So to raise tax rates or more likely cut government spending so that the government budget is balanced by the end of the decade. Whether this is likely or not, given Brexit, a lot of economists would say it's unlikely that will happen. Now, why it's important to balance the budget by the end of the decade is because the longer a budget deficit continues, the larger the debt that the government will accumulate. So the UK government now has debt that it needs to pay back of approximately, well, it's slightly more than this now, over £1.5 trillion. And they have to pay that back with interest. So there is current pressure to say we should reduce the national debt so that those interest payments are eliminated. So we've looked at what is meant by government expenditure and looked at some of the figures behind the UK's current position. Now let's look at the government expenditure, the relationship between that and aggregate demand and circular flow before moving on to the influences of government expenditure. So government expenditure and aggregate demand. Well, the government accounts for about 40% of all spending in the economy. But when we look at AD, that's not quite the full picture. A lot of the spending that the government undertakes is through things like welfare payments and benefits. And that money only really appears in the economy in terms of final goods and services when those people spend it as consumption. So some of the money the government spend goes to consumers who then spend it, so it shows up as consumption. So as a result, government expenditure, we would say, normally accounts for about 25% of aggregate demand in the UK. In terms of the relationship between government spending and the circular flow, well, we know that government expenditure is an injection within the circular flow, whilst taxation is a withdrawal. So, if government spending is greater than taxation, this means there is a budget deficit. But it also means we have a net injection into the circular flow of income and a higher national income. If government spending is less than taxation, then we would say the government is running a budget surplus. Now this would create a net withdrawal from the circular flow of income, so less aggregate demand. Okay, let's move on now to the main influences on government expenditure. The first one we're going to look at is the trade cycle, which is the way in which GDP fluctuates over time through recession, growth, boom, and slump. Now, in a period of economic growth, government expenditure tends to fall as we saw right at the start of this video, a large part of government spending is made up by welfare payments, such as job seekers payments. And if the economy is doing well and national income is rising and people's incomes are rising, then there is less of a requirement for government to make these payments. So the amount the government spends would typically reduce. In a recession or a slump, it tends to be the opposite. Government spending tends to rise as welfare payments increase. So if you look at that diagrammatically, what we're saying is that during periods of economic growth, government spending typically falls because there's less of a requirement to make welfare payments. So there's more likely that the government will have a budget surplus. However, when the economy is in recession or slump, when GDP is at a low level, then government spending will typically rise and we would expect to have a budget deficit. The second impact on or influence of government expenditure is fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to achieve a government's macroeconomic objectives. So the government will have certain objectives they want to achieve within the economy, and when they change government spending patterns or change rates of tax to achieve those, we would say they are using their fiscal policy. Fiscal relates to government spending and taxation. And so this is a tool of aggregate demand management that the government can use. They can use their fiscal policies. Now, fiscal policy means that the government can deliberately manipulate AD by overspending to encourage economic growth. And this was a policy advised by the economist John Maynard Keynes, particularly during times of recession. The government could have a proactive fiscal policy, increase government expenditure to promote economic growth. So let's have a little look at how this might work in practice. If we have a look at GDP in the trade cycle, where we're saying that GDP typically over time goes through periods of growth, boom, recession, slump, growth, and then boom again. So if we imagine this was without any fiscal policy. And then what we're going to do is look and see, right, we're going to introduce a fiscal policy and let's see what the impact might be on AD and then also on GDP. So during a period of economic growth with fiscal policy, the government will typically be charging tax, and as incomes rise, taxes will also increase. And the government won't be spending much. There's less need for welfare payments. So the impact of the government during times of economic growth might be a net withdrawal. So actual GDP might be lower than we imagined. So if we have a look at the dotted blue line here, this shows us what GDP might be like with fiscal policy. So during a period of growth, tax revenues are likely to exceed government spending. We're running a budget surplus, which is a withdrawal. So that's likely to be a handbrake on economic activity. Let's now have a look and see what would happen during a recession or a slump. Now, during a recession or a slump, economic activity would be declining, GDP would be decreasing or at a low level. Now, in that instance, when GDP declines, incomes decline, GDP is low, we would see less taxation, a low level of taxation. We'd also like to see more welfare payments from the government and increased government spending. Now that would lead to a budget deficit, which would be a net injection into the economy. We've got more government spending and less taxation. So actually, if the government runs a budget deficit, more money is coming into the economy, which would increase the level of GDP. So what we can see is that fiscal policy helps smooth GDP over time. So the policy, the introduction of fiscal policy will impact, or the extent to which they change fiscal policy will impact on the level of government spending in the economy. Fiscal policy can reduce the peaks of the economy and minimize the slump. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by government expenditure. We've looked at the relationship between government expenditure, AED, and the circular flow of income. And then finally, we looked at the main influences on government expenditure, which were the trade cycle and the extent of fiscal policy. That's it. Thank you very much.